Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar about a technical discussion about disaster recovery for critical infrastructures and production-grade cloud infrastructures. And today we are with Marsela, our cloud expert. Marsela is, yes, our cloud and security expert. She has all certifications on Azure and Terraform. So she will be talking today about the disaster recovery and how we can implement it and the best practices. Um, so just briefly, this webinar is sponsored by Brainboard, and I mean is done by Brainboard team. And Brainboard, in few words, is a solution that allows you, when I say you, I mean cloud architects, platform engineers, DevOps engineers, and even technical managers, that allows you to visually design and manage cloud infrastructures. We're going to use Brainboard to depict the different scenarios for the disaster recovery, and we'll be happy if you are interested. We can talk later. So now, Marcela, I hand it over to you.
Yes,
What
so,
are you going to talk about today?
so the agenda for today is that we're going, of course, to talk about the DR and the importance of DR and DR planning for infrastructure. Then we will be tackling some of the best practices for designing and implementing a DR plan. We will see how Brainboard and Terraform can simplify disaster recovery for infrastructures, and we will see also some examples and some solutions, some suggestions that we will give from our side for the disaster recovery implementation. Now, before we continue with the importance of DR, let's explain what is DR. Disaster recovery for infrastructure refers to the process of restoring essential systems like softwares, like data after a natural disaster, cyber attack, or any other disruptive event that affects the normal functioning of the infrastructure. A disaster can cause significant disruption to the organization operations, resulting in downtime that can affect the business revenue and also productivity. So, a disaster DR strategy helps minimize downtime by providing a plan of action to recover from a disaster quickly. Organizations rely on critical data and systems to run their operations. So the DR strategy also helps them protect this data and system by ensuring that they are backed up, they are restored, they are replicated, and they can be recovered. From my experience, many industries have regulatory requirements that mandate the need for a DR strategy. So they need to have a DR strategy. And the compliance with these requirements can help organizations avoid the legal penalties and also the reputational damage, which we also discussed together
Yeah,
earlier, that is really important.
exactly. Reputation sometimes is much more important than money because you cannot buy it with money. Once it's lost, and sometimes forever.
Yeah, and also this has to do with improvement of the customer confidence because the customer needs to know that the service will be up and running and that the company and the service provider has some plan in place in case of a disaster. And also the last point, which is really important, is cost effective. It is important because many companies think that if they are planning for a disaster, it will have a high cost. And maybe it will have costs that are not needed. But actually, if you see it in the long term, it is cost effective to plan ahead for a disaster recovery.
Yeah, this is a part that is usually not seen by companies because they just see it as like more expense and more investment, and we need it once. Yeah, so are we going to talk about the costs later and see?
Yes, we will
Yeah, the
also
visibility.
check the costs. Yeah.
All right. Oh yes, the disaster recovery scenarios. Where we were preparing the slides, like we realized there are two different things. There are the scenarios for the disaster recovery, and these are more technical implementation of what you can do, and there are the strategies which are more decision based things that you can implement, that you can have to implement the scenarios. So, Marcela, about the scenarios. What can we do to have disaster recovery in place, and what are the different scenarios that we can
Yeah,
implement?
there is a lot. There are a lot of techniques. There are a lot of methods that we can follow in order to implement disaster recovery. One would be that like the multi-region deployments, like cloud-based services remain operational even if a particular region in a particular cloud provider is impacted by a disaster. So the multi-region deployments ensure that the service will be running even if one region is down. Then one solution is the data replication, especially in cases of the databases. It is important to have some data replication, synchronous or asynchronous, during different between different region, and also between multiple availability zones. Then we have automated failover, which is important to have some automatic failover processes so that we don't have to do any a manual thing during this failover, and that we have a system that will handle this. Then we have the backup and restore, especially in the cases of storage accounts or databases. This is really helpful. Then we have testing, because it is important to do testing before, because disasters might happen anytime, so it is good to be prepared, and also to benefit from services that are coming from cloud based services, disaster recovery services. And the last part is the documentation. But I'm sure that many of the users that have worked with me have seen that I don't like to talk much about the theoretical part, because I like to show the technical as a technical person. So I will jump to Brainboard, and we can see one of the templates that I have built, and one of the scenarios that I want to show to our viewers.
Yeah, this is
So
what
you
I
can
was
see.
about to say. Yes,
Yes.
we mentioned a lot of things, but I'm personally a visual guy, so it's better that we see real examples and how we can use them.
Yes, same here. So I'm showing the schema because I want everybody that is seeing the schema to envision how this architecture looks, and also because we will be discussing about the solution for the DR for this specific infrastructure, giving different ideas. And since we are here, if I would really like to know also our viewers' opinion about the different scenarios for DR, if they have some opinion for each of these resources, and how we can find a solution to have high availability, and also to make sure that these services will be up and running even in case of a disaster recovery. So I will explain briefly how this infrastructure is working. So the traffic for this infrastructure will come to the traffic manager Azure endpoint. So we will use the traffic manager as a load balancer that will also redirect the traffic to a public IP. It will use also the DNS zone, and it will use a traffic manager. So this will be the first part where all the traffic from the internet will come.
And
And
this
then we
is,
will have,
Marcela,
yes,
if I can interrupt you, this
yeah,
is this is like the base architecture that you will use to build strategies on top. Like you're gonna replicate it, you're gonna maybe copy it, backup and restore, and all that, right? So,
yes, correct.
okay, so now you're explaining from the top to the bottom what
Yes.
are the
I
components and
always
how.
start with a network. I think the network part is one of the most important components when it comes to DR, because in this area, in this part, we are also making sure that we have the automated failover that we mentioned earlier, because the traffic manager will check if a certain region is up and running, or there is some disaster going on. So I always start with a network, because it's also complex and it has a lot of configurations that we need to handle in cases where we have multi-region, or we want to build another infrastructure in another region. But we will see also these scenarios later. So
Okay.
this is part of the network, which is really important. I want to like emphasize this, and also to everybody who is watching this and who wants to also to see the best practices of building a DR. Start by the network, by checking the network configuration and making sure that you will have the same configuration also in the other region that you are trying to build your infrastructure.
Yeah,
So
because
mhm,
just yeah here because that's very important, the separation between like the type of resources, because some resources are maybe just easy to backup and restore. Some of them are geographically replicated, so it's not that easy to replicate. Some of them are just stateless, you can just recreate them. So yeah, I would love to see like all these aspects when you talk about it and when you build a strategy around.
Yes, we will talk about all these resources. This infrastructure is the components of this infrastructure is we have a Linux web app where we will have probably some application that will be deployed in this Linux web app that is where it is using a service plan and also a Linux function app. This infrastructure also has a storage account to store the data, but also a Cosmos DB for the backend and for the storage of the data. And then we have a virtual network, a subnet, and a Linux VM with a network interface. These resources are different. These are replicated, are created in a different way. We have a different way to create the Cosmos DB. In another region, we don't even need to create the Cosmos DB, but I would like also to know like the opinion of the viewers. How do they handle the DR for Cosmos DB? Because maybe there are some scenarios that there is some replication going on. We also have the storage account, which is replicated differently, and we can benefit in this case from resources that or from services that come directly from the cloud provider. We have the service plan and the Linux web app, which we usually, for the creation in another region of the Linux web app and service plan, we create these resources, most probably benefiting from the advantages of infrastructure as code, and in our case Terraform, and then we can deploy the application there. For the Linux VM, we can use the service of Azure, of course, to replicate, but usually it's done. We can, for example, create a backup, take the images, maybe have a registry, and replicate all the information to the other region, and just start the VM with the image that we want. So
Yeah,
there
and
are.
maybe just before we go, just a quick question for the community and for
Yeah.
those who are listening to us. Feel free also to comment about the strategy that you are implementing now within your company, if you have one. And we'll be happy to answer the questions related to that, and see what the community are using out there, if there are different techniques.
Yes, and it drew my attention one of the questions, I think from Tiago, about the modules, because we
Yeah.
mentioned the modules. The modules are really important also in the DR, because by using modules, we make sure that we create the resources in the same way in different environments and in different regions. So yes, Brainboard also support the modules, and we use them often to make sure that we have the same version of the resources in different environments in different regions. In this case, we haven't used them. I have just mentioned them, but of course, they can be used.
And it is nice also in this architecture that we see the different components, like from VM to networking to Cosmos DB, which is geographically replicated, to web apps and so on. So we wanted to make like hybrid components. We didn't mention and we didn't talk about Kubernetes. This is something that we can talk about later. Yeah.
Yes, in
Right.
this scenario, I use the Linux web app, but of course, like Kubernetes is used a lot, and it's really helpful also when we have the multi-cloud deployments. So it can be used in different cloud providers, and it's really helpful, and it's really used. So we definitely can also discuss how we can do the DR of the Kubernetes. So I want to go back
The
to
multi-region
the
maybe.
strategies, because
Okay.
before I go and I show two of the strategies, I want to just to mention the strategies that can be used when we are doing the planning of disaster recovery. The first one is backup and restore. This is the most used, this is the oldest, maybe the cheapest when it comes to doing the DR, because you just need to do the backup of the data. And when we are creating the other region and creating the other infrastructure, you can just back up all the data and restore the information. And then after the backup, the one that is like similar to backup and restore. It's the light pilot methodology. This involves like having a small amount of the infrastructure, not the whole infrastructure, running in the cloud at all times. But this small amount has the ability to scale up. So this method is used usually when you have like a few resources that you want to have, like for example a VM. You have it turned off and it can be turned on in the case of a disaster recovery. And also, like similar to the pilot lights, the warm standby has the same logic. Like we have a portion of the infrastructure running, and at the moment that we have a disaster recovery, we scale up a full deployment. Then we have a hot standby, which I'm going also to show it as a scenario in Brainboard. This is typically, it's the most expensive, but also the one who provides the fastest recovery time. And it involves like having a full running infrastructure in a cloud that can be quickly switched over in the event of a disaster. So in this case, we have a whole infrastructure with all the components that is up and running and can be activated at any time. And the last one is the cloud-to-cloud replication, which involves replicating data and services from one cloud provider to the other. But this is really, really complex, but for sure it can be done also within Brainboard, and it's really helpful to have also the design when you are doing this kind of cloud-to-cloud replication, because you can see both scenarios and you can do also the comparison. And I think we discussed for the cloud-to-cloud provider to the cloud-to-cloud replication, the part of the Kubernetes. You had something,
Yes.
information, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about this. I mean, when I see all these strategies, I do realize how not easy it can be. I mean, not easy and sometimes costly, and sometimes needs different knowledge from different areas. Like you talked about the hot standby, that it's the most efficient one, but it costs a lot. And if we talk about backup and restore, I mean, we need another solution for the backup and restore. And if we use cloud to cloud replication, it's also new technology. If we want to, maybe you mentioned Kubernetes, but like we want to have Kubernetes span across multiple cloud providers. So we need knowledge, learning curve, and a lot of effort to make it work.
Yes.
So I would love to see this in practice and how
Yes.
I can bring it all with different strategies.
Yes. So the first scenario that I will explain here is the scenario where, in the event of a disaster recovery, I will replicate and create the whole infrastructure from scratch. So I won't have an environment up and running. I will only make it active and create it in the case of the disaster recovery. Now, how can I do it with Brainboard? It is so simple. With the sync, we have the option to have a synchronization between different regions and different environments. So what I will do is I will create a sync. It's like another infrastructure that will be synced all the time with the infrastructure that you saw now. How we can do this is that we can go to clone this architecture, and I will explain all the functionalities. I will Let me create.
Or
Oh
maybe
no!
create.
First, I will create. Yes, we mentioned as a best practice. Before, I will explain the best practice. Now, if you want to have a disaster recovery implementation for all your projects, as a best practice is to create a new directory within your project and have a disaster recovery folder with all the Terraform files and all the configurations that you need for the disaster recovery. So, for example, I will create here a
And by
DR.
the way, we have great questions from the audience.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, let me. I will just save them. When you finish, I will talk about them.
That's great. Because I wanted questions and I wanted to be challenged about this DR, because I know that there are many solutions and there are different ways you can do the DR. So it's always good to have discussions and to learn
And
about
also,
also new ways.
yeah, the different scenarios, because it depends on what you have. You may or may not implement a specific strategy. So, all right. So now you created the disaster recovery disaster recovery
directory. So
environment, and you sync every critical architecture for which you want to have disaster recovery within this environment, that you can see it quickly.
or I will write it region 2,
Okay.
just to know that this is for region 2.
All right.
Next, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep these two environments synced. And every time that there is a change in one of the environments of one of the configurations and Terraform codes of my infrastructure that is already in production, I will also have the change in the synced architecture. So I will just use the sync.
Yeah, just to explain it briefly, what the sync is, while Marsela is doing the operation, the syncing two architectures or two environment means that any modification that you do to one architecture, it will be automatically replicated to the other one, uh, except the values of the variables, because the values of the variables are specific to the environment itself. And they will both have a different Terraform state, which means if you have the application running and you are deploying the application, the day you have a disaster and you want to recover, you can create the other one without touching the Terraform state that you already have. You just create the whole complete infrastructure that is the exact copy of this one without touching the Terraform state. And I can see a new button now in Brainboard, the sync indicator.
Yes. So in here, we can see that we have the sync information, and we can check also the other architectures that are synced with the architecture that I just synced, and I can switch and I can check both of them. And what is important, like change variables, because I'm sure that we want to have some configuration that is different, like even the names of some resources, like because they are global, maybe they need to be different. So the variables will be different in one architecture and in comparison to the one that is in production. And yes, Terraform Sync for disaster recovery like has many benefits. It allows to automate the process of setting up a secondary environment and can save time, reduce the risk of human error, because I have everything synced. I'm not typing manually everything. I have just these two architectures that I know for sure are the same.
Yeah.
It ensures that the secondary environment is an exact duplicate of the primary environment with all the configurations, and this can help like minimize downtime, ensure like business continuity, and it allows the user to easily switch between environments. If we want at a certain moment, not just consider this as a DR, but also like having a test environment that is the same way as it is the production environment, we can do it with using the sync. And when you have some testing that you want to do, you are sure that it's the same
Yeah.
infrastructure.
One
So
of the
this is
questions from
yes.
Sebastian, sorry I interrupted you. He said, can you use the sync to level dev test prod? Yes, this is exactly the first purpose of the sync feature, is to allow you to have the same architecture across multiple environments, dev, staging, QA, production, and separate and isolate every environment with its own variables. Nice catch.
Yes, and I was thinking that we could use it. Yeah, after we used it for the different environment, I was thinking that yes, this can be also beneficial for the DR, which is a really good scenario where sync can be used. And just to clarify, for this scenario that we have here, we will create a whole architecture for in the other region. Besides the Cosmos DB I mentioned earlier, it's a global service, and it will be the same also because I saw that some user mentioned the Active Directory. There are some services that are global. It is easy in because I have one subscription. I'm using one subscription for both regions and one tenant. And for one tenant, it's easy. I'm sure that everybody will agree that it's easy. For multi-tenants, I know it is a struggle, and I also like had to work on that, and it is difficult to sync the users between two different tenants. But there are services from Azure that can be used in these cases, if we want to have a synchronization between Active Directory in two different uh, tenants or two different subscriptions, and also we can back up and restore, create the same users, and also use Terraform. Terraform is really helpful for the management of Active Directory, and in Brainboard we can also manage the Active Directory. So yes, it is a challenge. I totally agree, but there are ways that this can be handled.
And
So
yes,
besides,
sorry, and this is like it brings another question about when we implement disaster recovery, do we implement it within the same provider? So we stay within the same provider and rely on the global services, as you mentioned, for example, Cosmos DB, or we say, okay, we do not trust the just one provider, but we want to have a second cloud provider as a recovery plan. And then so you need to have a lot of work and customization, especially on these specific part like Active Directory and all the resources that are replicated geographically replicated by the provider itself.
I would suggest, of course, to have a whole different subscription, a whole different tenant, but then there will be performance issue because we also want to make the sync. We also want to transfer the data, for example, the data for the storage account and the data for the VM, and it will take a lot of time to do the sync and to do the restore between these two. So at the end, it comes to the RPO and RTO and how much time the company can afford to lose and how much data they can afford to lose. So it's different. Of course, the best scenario would be to have a total different tenant. It would be more expensive, like it will require more costs, it will require more maintenance, but still that's the best practice, I think, to have another subscription or a whole other tenant. But the cases of a region being down are not that common. So we are preparing for the worst, but we should like also be realistic that these are not scenarios that are much common because cloud providers are trying to make sure that at least not the whole region will be down. There are cases when maybe one availability zone can be down. So besides the part of the DR, I want to emphasize also the importance of having high availability in each of the resources. So we can even handle the high availability of Cosmos DB, high availability of a Linux VM, because the cloud providers offer that. And that is also important. Besides the sync, the other scenario that I want to show is one of the scenarios that I like the most and enjoy the most when we have active because this is in this scenario we make sure that the infrastructure and the whole application that we have in one region will be up and running like in maybe in a couple of minutes. It will be really quick to have everything in place when we have an active strategy. Now, I'm sure I will have questions for this one, and I hope I have questions. And I invite everybody to go and test in that to use this solution because this is a really good solution and the solution that is also recommended from the cloud provider from Azure. We are using Azure, but also it's the same logic with the other cloud providers. We have a traffic manager profile. Like as I mentioned earlier, we have the first component of the network, and the traffic manager profile makes sure that if one of the regions is down, it will automatically redirect the traffic in the other region. So we don't need to like check the whole time if a region is down and do manual things. This will be automatically. And also there are other services from Azure like site recovery that we can benefit from and can manage everything in order to have the two regions up and running all the time and not have like moments when one of the regions is down and the service is not operating. Now I'm going to take the services one by one.
Yeah, just quick question, Marcela. So here, what I see, like before in the old
Yeah.
architecture, we had just one portion of the application, and now you replicated the complete region into a second one, and you put them in a way that you can put active, 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 passive. You can strategize, right?
Yes, that's true. So both of these are up and running. In these two regions, we will have a storage account, we will have a virtual machine, we will have the Linux web app, and everything will be like up and running in both of the regions. And the replica is created for each component, like not just in this architecture, this is just a reference, but also in the other architectures or infrastructures that the users might have. In cases when we have like active, all the resources that are part of one region need to have a replica in the other region. Besides, of course, of the resources that we mentioned, that is, for example, the Cosmos DB account, which has geo-replication activated and doesn't need to be replicated, because even if this region is down, if we have a string connection, for example, in the Linux web app from the application, it will direct to the same Cosmos DB. The Cosmos DB won't be down. And also the Active Directory doesn't need to be like replicated in this, at least in this scenario, between the two regions, because it's a global service. Same for the Traffic Manager. The other resources need to be replicated, need to have a exact same resource in the other region. Now, in this scenario, I have created for the Linux VM, I have created another VM, and I'm doing backups of the VM and transferring the backups. Now, there will be another process that will be doing this transfer of the backups. But to make it easier, I created a peering between the two VNets, so it is easier for them to communicate. So I don't have like to download something and then go to the other region and then upload something. They are connected to each other, so we have this peering, and they can communicate. So it is faster. This is for performance issue. Then I'm benefiting from storage object replication. This is a service from Azure. It makes sure that the storage account is always replicated, because storage account is really important. It can contain really important data, sensitive data. So we have a storage container created in both regions. We have a storage object replication. This is the best way that we can do the replication of the storage account. And every time that a change is done in one of the regions, in the first region, the primary region, these changes are also replicated in the storage account in the other region. For the service plan and Linux web app, I have created the same resources in the other region. I have a public IP, which will also be connected to the DNS. So we have different DNS for the both regions, but that will be connected to a DNS server that will be central, so that if a user is accessing a certain application, he doesn't see what is going on and that we have changed something on the DNS. He won't even notice that something is going on. So this is the best way that we can have active strategy for the DR.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions from the community. I'm trying to follow. And one of the questions, I think Luis asked about the Terraform state consistency. He said, let me read it in a consistent way. He said, deployment of a replica environment doesn't ensure you have guaranteed the state consistency when the failure occurs. So how do you plan to ensure no data loss? Actually, we do this within Brainboard. Marsela just showed that when you do the sync of two different architectures, you can specify two different remote backends. And two different remote backends, which means the state will be stored into two different places. This is just one of the scenarios. And when you deploy the second, the replica, you are completely isolated from the first one, and the state it will have its own state. One of the questions as well from Sebastian. By the way, I love your questions. You asked 2 or 3. So I'm going to pick the first one. it's about, he said, in a DRP for web app is simple. My difficulties are with active directories, my Zscaler VMs, managed instances failover, switching the front door from one region to another one. What can you say, Marcela, about all these? Like maybe some of them related to the data itself, some to the configuration of the resource.
Yes, there are. I started by saying the Active Directory, which is a real issue, and I know that there are challenges when it comes to Active Directory. But as I said, there are services in Azure because ADS. I have also used other services that are specific to Azure, and Microsoft supports for this part. At least in my experience, I've done this management of the Active Directory between two tenancies, and I had to request some support from Microsoft. So we need you don't have full rights to manage everything for the Active Directory. This is the advice that I can give, just to request for support, because they are constantly upgrading and doing changes of these resources. So maybe they have published some new service that does the management of the Active Directory. Also, I know that for the managed services failover, this is also a struggle, and you need like to be able to check the configuration for from one region to the other. So in these cases, I would just suggest to have to use infrastructure as code, to use Terraform, and to make sure that the configuration is the same. For the front door from one region to another, it is the configuration inside the front door. It's the same as I did the configuration for the traffic manager. So since I have it here, it's something similar to the traffic manager profile. So we need to check the traffic routing methods. So please, for also for the front door, check the traffic, how it is routed. In this case, it's I put the configuration as weighted, because I'm checking like if the traffic is coming to one region, it's checking that the region is down, it will go to to the other region. So it basically comes to the traffic routing methods, and uh, this is the way that this is configured. That the also the front door is configured, because traffic manager and the front door are two of the methods that are used for DR, also from Microsoft. These are the suggestions. So other
Yeah.
refactor of the applications, yes, that's true, but it comes to on-prem and cloud, and the process when it comes to when it is like on-prem and cloud is a bit different. And the infrastructure maybe cannot help much in this side, because there is a lot of refactoring that is needed for the application to work. But if you are using a Terraform, at least for the infrastructure that is behind the application, that it might be helpful. There are a lot of points. I would suggest Sebastian to book a meeting. We can discuss it together, because I think this
Yes.
is really interesting. And if I see these topics, I cannot stop talking, and we will
Yes,
yeah
Sebastian, we would
yeah.
love to have a call, like dedicated call with you and answer all these questions. But yeah, some of them are like helps the community as well. And when talking about the application, in some cases it may include refactoring the application to plan for the disaster recovery. This is one of the things. Yeah, maybe you're going to talk about it, because managers or some organization, they think that the disaster recovery is just the infrastructure, but part of it is also how you build the application that you will host on the infrastructure, and how you recover it in case you have a disaster.
Yes, actually, if you have the same environment, the disaster recovery can, like the ways that we showed here, can also help on the part of the application. Because if you have the same version, if you have the environment synced and you are sure that it's the same configuration, you don't need to do refactoring on the application side. So it helps on the also on the application side. The only thing that might be different is a pipeline, because for sure there is some certain pipeline that will have the information and the deployment of the application. There is just a configuration on the pipeline probably, and that's the only change. So just keep in mind that this way of doing the DR, it's also beneficial for the application.
Yes. All right. And you had a different scenario. I don't know if you talked about. I was answering maybe the warm standby and hot standby in the same architecture.
Okay, yes, I will talk also about the warm standby, how we can do the warm standby in here. Now, if we know that we don't need this architecture in here, will have some cost. So I'm sure that if we have cloud architects in here, we care about the cost. We don't want to have a whole infrastructure up and running and that is expensive, that has a lot of data. So what we can do in this case is to have a warm standby is to scale down or to shut down some of these resources. For example, the Linux VM, I can shut it down. I don't need it the whole time. And also, I can just not keep the storage account with the computing possibilities that are maximum for the storage account. I can keep it like basic or just not keep it as a premium. We can scale down everything in the architect in this infrastructure, and in the moment when we will have a disaster recovery, we can scale up, we can activate everything, and this is called like a warm standby. This infrastructure is not operational, but can be operational really quickly. So this is the way that this can be done. This can be done by variables. We can implement a pipeline that can do this in the moment that we want to activate this region and have everything in place. And this can be also done with the sync, because as we said, like we can benefit from the variables. If we are using the variables for the configurations of the resources and we are putting a different, for example, like as I said, standard or premium, we can also implement the warm standby by using the sync. So this is how this can be done in
Oh yeah, talking about the variables. Yeah, I saw that you put in one of the architectures, like you put a variable in the count. I think you say
yes,
if
correct.
I'm in one region, I'm not gonna deploy, and if I'm in the main region, I'm gonna deploy. Yes, if you can.
Yeah, true. So for the lovers of Terraform, me included, I will show the part of the code. So when I created the Azure RM Cosmos DB account in Terraform, because this is like part of the Terraform, I put the count. And I'm saying if I'm in the region when the var.environment, if I'm in the first region and I check if I'm in like the infrastructure that I'm building, it's in the first region, region 1, then please create this Cosmos DB. But if I'm going to the second region, then don't create. The value of the count will be 0 and this won't be created. So this is really helpful in the cases where you want to create a resource in one of the regions and not in the other region. And as one of the users mentioned, for example, also in testing, when you have testing, you don't want to have everything that you have in production also to have it on testing. So you can use this variable also for testing. In the same way as we mentioned for the modules that are really helpful, also these other advantages that infrastructure as code offers can be beneficial for the DR. And I think that we also mentioned, should we go to the challenges or to the best practices? Because
Yeah, let's go to the challenges maybe
okay,
because we
let's
have
start
been.
with the challenges
Yeah,
and then we can also check the best practices, because we have mentioned also the best practices there.
yeah, because especially like as we are talking about the disaster recovery and what you explain and you have seen, To be honest, and also from the questions of the community, we can see how complex it is, and like different configuration. And by the way, we had a question from Smriti Ranjan about uh, just we take this question quickly, Marcella, if you may. He said, can you explain if one of my cloud DBs is not hosted multi-region config and by unwillingly it has been impacted with AZ downtime, how can we handle such scenario from affecting our live production? I mean, if you care about live production, you need to prepare before, like either activate the multi-region config or do a backup restore, a backup that will be able to restore, or have replica, a read-only replica that you can turn into read-write. So you have different scenarios that you can plan before. And again, if it's the production is critical, I would go for the multi-region protection, because I mean, you do not worry about it when bad things happen. All
Or
right.
or maybe I can add something because
Yeah.
from my experience as a developer, besides the part of the infrastructure, what you can do if this is too critical and you cannot deploy it in different regions, when you have the insert of the data, so the creation of the data inside the database with the pipeline from the application side, you can configure everything to be like inserted and created in two different databases. This can be also done from the application side, not just from the infrastructure side. So there are many ways that you can add the data, and this can also be a scenario to make sure that even if this database is down, you have another database, but then you might have some problem with the performance, but it depends. This is just a solution that came to my mind because I'm used also to develop, so I see it also in the developer perspective.
Okay. And yeah, and this is one of the part of the complexity as well. So yes, and how to deal with the complexity. I mean, about the complexity and all what we have seen. Um, so how do you? What do you suggest? How to navigate the complexity?
Take the resources one by one first. Do not try to tackle like everything, see it as complex, like because if you try to manage everything in the same time, it will really be complex. That's why for me, when I was seeing visually the part of the creation of the two regions, it was like so helpful for me to see it visually and to create the mirror in the other side. So tackle every resource one by one. um, Keep in mind the part of the network. I will try to emphasize the network part because I think this is really important. So make sure the network is handled. um, Check also what are the resources, then the services from the cloud provider. The cloud provider is like all the cloud providers are publishing services all the time and are helping users and customers with different scenarios. And then plan ahead and test, do a lot of tests. This is what I can say in order like to manage the complexity and the difficulties that might come with the implementation of the DR.
Yeah, and about tests as well. I mean, I saw it in the comment from the community that the tests may be tricky, because when you test a disaster recovery, uh, you cannot test everything, and sometimes it implies using real data, so you cannot just play with it. Um, so for the test, if you use infrastructure as code, maybe you try to replicate, to create on a regular basis the same infrastructure elsewhere, to make sure that, okay, this is the day it happens, I'm able to do it, and you are trained on the exercise. Anything that you can add on the testing, Marcel, and how we can have a good implementation?
What I would do, what I would suggest for testing is to have a process in place where the testing can be done, for example, every 3 months, every 6 months. In Brainboard, I would create a pipeline that would do that. For example, like add a trigger to create the pipeline, for example, every 3 months, add a Terraform plan, add a Terraform apply, add maybe some checks for the cost, because of
Oh
course it
yes,
is good to make sure, and we are coming to the topic of the cost. I would add infra cost, because maybe there is some budget and we are going beyond the budget that is planned for the DR. So I would put the infra cost, I would put the TFSEC, I would notify maybe the manager, or notify the other users and my colleagues that I'm testing this. And also a webhook, I can send a message maybe to an application and confirm, yes, this DR is tested, this environment is tested, and if a disaster is happening, then the disaster recovery is in place. So for testing, I would suggest this as a scenario. And what else? Also security and compliance, as I mentioned, like the TFSEC, and also the if we have some policies, because I'm sure that the companies that are really dealing with disaster recovery also will have some policies in place, because this is in disaster recovery is related directly to the security. So yes, we need to make sure that these policies are applied also against the new region that we are building.
and
And
yeah, this is very important because security and compliance may bring more complexity to the process. For example, I used to work in a bank, and for example, for PCI DSS environment, even the any kind of environment that works with the main one should be PCI DSS compliant, because the same information may flow into different regions or different component. Uh, so like the security, even if it's a challenge per se, it will add another challenge, another complexity to the existing ones.
yeah, so true. And also for security, I'm sure that when we are developing a DR, we need to do like a whole process, a whole documentation. Maybe I didn't stop much on the documentation part, but I know that it's really important that there is some documentation in place, and having it graphically, seeing everything, having infrastructure as code is really helpful also to define the process. And even if there are people who don't know anything about this infrastructure, they will have it documented very well, and it will be helpful also for them to trigger everything and to have the disaster recovery process in place in case something happens, because we are considering the disaster recovery of a region, but we have also like to consider also people that are going to work with this disaster recovery. And when it comes to best practices, we mentioned some of them.
Yes, talking about
Automation, we have,
yeah,
yes, infrastructure as code.
and yeah, and in Brainboard you can also this is something that's really cool. You can create multiple workflows. This is something that will be coming in the few days, where you can create multiple workflows, and you can have a specific workflow for the DR, and trigger it on a schedule, like schedule it that will be triggered like every 3 months, as you mentioned, Marcella, or every a certain amount of time, and it will send you automatically the report about how it goes, and you can plan ahead of time what to do.
Yes, that's a good point, Luis, because I saw it now. Yes, that's true. It happened to me because uh, some resources are not available in whole regions, and that's true. We need to make
Yes.
sure that they are. Thank you. That was a good point.
Yeah.
And we have also other questions. I will make sure to respond even after this event to the other questions.
Yes. So yeah, we make sure that we reach out to you
Also to the
and we
DNS, I saw that there
yeah.
the DNS was mentioned. I added the DNS, but yes, there is some configuration that is needed for the DNS in cases of disaster recovery. I mentioned it that it will be connected to the IP of each region, but there is some extra configuration in the DNS zone that will be part. It depends. It can be part of the variables. If you are using the sync, it can also be configured like having two DNS zones and activating one and the other depending if we have the DNS, if we have one region up and or the other one. So there are different methods. And if there is some specific scenario that one of the users might have, they can contact us directly so we can discuss it and we go deeper into the different use cases, because this is a general use case, but of course it is every company has its specific rules, implementations, services, so we can check them.
And yeah, for the community, yes, if you have like special use cases, reach out to us. We can help or recommend anything that we know. Yeah. And for the best practices, yes, the modular design. I'm interested in this, Marcella. What does it mean, the modular design?
It's exactly what one of the users mentioned in the beginning. It's
About
using modules. So modules are really helpful in the cases of disaster recovery, because in this way we make sure that both regions have the same configuration. In my case, what I did here, I could have used a module for example, for the network interface and for the Linux VM, because for with Brainboard is so easy to copy paste. And I use it like often, like you can just create another, for example, another resource here, another like subnet, and it is easy. I didn't have the need to create a module and use it in both scenarios. But of course, it is really beneficial in cases of disaster recovery. This is mainly to make sure that the configuration is the same, and that in the cases where we need to activate one region, you don't need to change a lot of variables. If you have a module, you don't need to add all the configuration, all the resources. You just need to, you can hard code some of them, and you can just add, for example, an address space or some other configuration.
Yeah, they can be also environment specific. You put them in the value, and when the environment change, it will pick the one of the environment. I see now.
Yeah.
All right, and we have 3 minutes remaining before the
Yes.
end of our session. So I would like to thank everyone. I mean, everyone, you, Marcella, the community, and everyone who assisted and asked questions. We will reach out to all those who ask questions about the answers. And for the special session of today, we have a discount for individual licenses. So if you take an individual license today, use this code BBDR23. You have 50% discount for a year. So use it if you are planning to buy a Brainboard subscription. This is just for the individual licenses, but we are like helping individual people to get even to buy professional services, and you can use it. And we have the last question from Sebastian. Can Brainboard scan my subscription and sync, right? Why it's not that simple? Yeah, Brainboard can scan your subscription, bring it back, generate the design and the code. We can talk about it when we have our call together, Sebastian. So again, thank you, everyone. Have a great day or evening. If you need any information about Brainboard, reach out to us, like even me personally, or Marcella, or Tarek, Benjamin, Grant, anyone from Brainboard. We are always happy to help. And now we have a new feature within Brainboard, so you can, which is a chat within Brainboard. You can talk to us when you are using Brainboard from the application, and we will help you in real time. So thanks again, and see you in another tech session. And goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. See you, everyone. Bye.